All right, Algebra 2, we are looking at graphing linear inequalities. Okay, so not too hard because we've done some graphing lines, but now we're going to be looking at inequalities, which is mostly, not all, but mostly about shading. That's like the new layer that we're adding on to this whole thing. So as you're looking through this stuff, you really want to be asking yourself, how do I graph a line first? Take a look at that. But then you're going to be adding on top of that, how do I graph and shade the inequality? Okay, so let's jump into a couple things here. First, we do want to remember graphing a line. One thing that we've looked at is finding the slope and like a point such as an intercept. So if we have y equals something times x plus something over here, and then we know that the second piece of there is the intercept, and then the piece with the x is the slope. Okay, so those are the things that we've been looking at. Now something we're going to add on top of this is the whole inequality relationship, and how do we figure that out? Well, instead of us looking at this as a line, now we're going to actually look as more as like a boundary. We'll call it, a boundary line, or just a boundary. And if it's not equal to, so like let's say it's just, less than or greater than, it's a dotted line. So it's not equal. It's not equal. But if it's like the or equal to, so if you have the less than or equal to, or the greater than or equal to, then that would be a solid line. So either we're going to have a dotted line or a solid line and some shading. And for the shading, we're going to be looking at one key thing, and that's testing a point. So we're going to test some points, or at least one point. So let's do it. Here we go. The first thing, again, graphing lines, that's what you start with. So it says sketch the graph of each linear inequality. So first, let's just sketch the graph of the line. So first I have the y equals negative 2x plus 5. It's a lot like y equals negative 2x plus 5. The 5 represents the y-intercept. We can start with that. So I'm going to mark right here at 5 a y-intercept. Now on top of this, I see the negative 2 with the x. That's really like a negative 2 over 1, and that represents my slope. So negative 2 over 1 means that I can go down 2 and then right 1, and I can repeat that pattern, almost give myself like a dotted line to draw this line through. Okay, so there's my line. Now let's start looking at the boundary. So first you start with like your slope and point. So you kind of start with the dots. Then we look at and check. Now we're looking at the boundary line. Is it equal or not equal? This is like the or equal to, and this is the not equal. Because the or equal would be a solid line, and then the dotted line would be for the not equal. This one is an or equal to because it has this little line down there. So that means I can take my little line drawing thing here. I'm going to draw a line. Let's make sure that I have it with arrows on it. Yep. But it's going to be a solid line. This boundary line goes straight through. There we go. Now when I want to look at shading, I'll keep shading the same color as well. I need to test a point. So the next thing on my list is test. And it's probably easiest to test 0, 0. But whatever point you test by plugging it in, it cannot be on the boundary line. So it's got to be off the boundary line. One side or the other. All right, so it's got to be off the boundary. So I'm going to test 0, 0, which means I just take my original relationship and I plug in 0, 0. So I plug in 0, 0 into that original relationship. I'll have 0, 0. That's like my x and y. And we know that y is greater than or equal to negative 2x plus 5. So now we plug in the 0 for the y and the 0 for the x. Let's see what happens. 0 is less or greater than or equal to negative 2 times 0 plus 5. Well, that would mean that 0 is greater than or equal to 5. Now this is something that's false. So one side of this line is true and one side of this line is false. That means this side with the 0, 0 right there, is false. But the other side is true. Now, should be some common sense here, but if that means this other side is true, that means we're going to be shading the true side. Now, if you didn't trust me, let's say we just picked a point over here, like this point here, 5, 5, right there. If I were to plug in 5, 5, let's see what would have happened. That'd be 5 is greater than or equal to 2 times negative 2 times 5, and then plus 5. All right, let's see what that would give us. 5 is greater than or equal to negative 10 plus 5, which is true. 5 is greater than or equal to negative 5. So that's true. So it did work, that this side that was kind of on the upper right is true, while the other one is false. Okay, let's do another one. But this time, maybe we'll do a different color just to keep it a little different. Let's see what we have. So number 2 here, we have a slope and an intercept, just like the last one. So the y-intercept is 1. I'll mark that on my y-axis. And the slope happens to be negative 1 over 1. Even though it's just a negative x, it's really negative 1 over 1. So I'll mark those dots. There's negative 1 over 1. I'm just going down 1, right 1, down 1, right 1, all the way through here. And then it gives me something to trace. Okay, so there's my dotted line, I guess. So I got my line started. Now let's check the boundary. So I want to see, is it equal to, not equal to? Are we dotted, solid? Right here, this is not equal to. It's not equal. So that means that it's only greater than or only less than, not equal to. That means we're only going to have a dotted line. So that means I need to draw a line in here. Instead of solid, it's going to be dotted or dashes. There we go. There's our line. Now we got to shade. So we got the boundary done, check. Now we got to shade and see where that's going to take us. So for the shading, let's test a point. I'm going to test 0, 0 again, right there in the middle. So I have this inequality, y is greater than negative 1 over 1 times x plus 1. And I'm going to plug in a point 0, 0. X is 0, y is 0. So that means 0 is greater than or equal to negative 1 times 0 plus 1. Negative 1 times 0 is 0. We add 1. 0 is greater than or equal to 1. That is not true. That's false. Again, which means this side with the 0, 0 right there is false. Which means the other side is true, which means the other side receives all the shading. All right, so we're doing pretty well here. We're about 8 minutes in. That's just a couple of examples just to get you warmed up. If you need to, watch those again. But we're going to do, a second video and probably even a third video here. But I'm going to keep them pretty short just so you guys can, keep it fresh, keep moving on.